Can I start?
Yes, please.
Okay. So, welcome everyone to another exciting session of Parda. As you know, my name is Salman Tour, and together with me, Asim Ijaz, we are the host of the session. And today it's a very, um, you can say, an important session for us where we're gonna discuss a very pertinent topic. Uh, the title is Scientific Thought and Muslim Societies. In this session, the idea is that we will try to understand what are the key points and challenges that we have in Muslim society currently when it comes to the scientific thought process. And also, how should we if there is anything that we need to change, or if there is anything that we need to modify in our societies, what those should be in terms of moving forward in this scientific thought process in our societies. And on this topic, it is our great pleasure that today we have Professor Nidhal Guessoum with us. He's professor of physics and astronomy at American University Sharjah. Together with that, he has written several books on science and Muslim society, and he's ranked 22 among the top thought leaders in Arab society, Arab world, and also 100 top in the top 100 scholars in when it comes to the space sciences. Professor Nidhal, very welcome to the platform. And before we go towards Professor Nidhal, I think I can quickly mention about the format of our platform. So what we're gonna do today is that first Professor Guessoum will tell us or share his thoughts with us, and then after that, the idea is that first me and Asim will ask a few questions, and then we will go to the questions from the audience. And so please share your questions on in this comment section, and we will take it in the before the end of the session. Yes, with that, Professor Guessoum, uh, please start.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Salman and Dr. Asim, for this wonderful invitation. And I must admit that I was not familiar with the platform, with Farda moving forward, and your efforts at addressing various issues and topics relevant to Muslim societies. And I felt flattered to be contacted and be asked to talk about scientific thought and Muslim societies, which is a very, very broad topic, but extremely important in all its dimensions. I have assembled a number of slides, as usual with teachers and speakers. They tend to bring more material than they realistically can cover. And so forgive me if at some point I just sort of flip through the slides quickly, but at least it will be just a mention that, okay, here's this idea, and we can come back to it and discuss it during the Q&A if need be. The reason why there is quite a bit of material to cover is because I wanted, in discussion with my dear hosts, to go back to history a little bit and understand what we did right in the past, not to be nostalgic and to always harp on our golden age and all that, but just to examine the past, to learn from it, what happened, what did we do right, what was not so right actually, including, for example, looking at what do we know about the status of women in science in the Islamic civilization? How much did they contribute? Do we know much? What role did they play? For example, things like that. And then quickly as possible, move to the present and see what is the situation with. We are using scientific thought to be sort of a very broad expression, and I will later sort of zoom or focus it on what we call scientific literacy, culture of science, scientific research. There's all kinds of dimensions to this scientific thought. So without delaying too much, let's get on with the topic. So science flourished in the Islamic era. Why? So that is the first question. So if you ask people, especially Muslims, They would say science was doing great. We had so many scholars, there were so many inventions and contributions and so on. But what happened? Why did science take root and flourish and really blossom in the Islamic civilization, in the Islamic societies? Before we look at what is happening today in the last century or more, and so on. So there are two large theories as to why science flourished or why science developed and quickly took root. One was sort of a utilitarian view, and I'll come back to this later because this is an important view that prevails today. Science should be utilitarian, should be useful, should be applicable and needed by the Muslim individual or the Muslim community. So we see, for example, that there are special religious needs for science. We need to calculate prayer times. We need to determine the direction of Mecca. We need to determine, we need to construct an Islamic calendar, determine the beginning and end of the month of Ramadan, determine when Hajj is going to occur, and so on. And then there's, for example, mathematical needs, such as calculating zakat, calculating mirath, inheritance, doing commerce, and so on. And we know, for those who have studied, history a little bit, that, for example, the famous important seminal book by Al-Khwarizmi, the book of algebra, Kitab al-Jabr wal-Muqabala, the book of algebra, and he explains that he is now introducing and developing this new mathematical technique called algebra. In the first few pages, he gives examples from daily life. He says, if, for example, a woman dies and she has a debt and she has a husband and several kids, and how are you going to calculate and divide the inheritance? If somebody has a commerce and is going to calculate and earn and pay and this and that. And so he shows that there is direct and practical benefit to this new tool that he is calling al-jabr or algebra, which is how do you write an equation and how do you balance it and so on. And then there is, of course, the need for medicine, the need for architecture. We're going to build big buildings because the community is growing. We need to have big mosques and so on and so forth. The second theory is science was from the beginning glorified. It was a type of knowledge that was glorified in the scripture, in the Quran and in the Hadith. So I won't go into detail on this, but as is known, and people have written a lot about this, saying you can count hundreds of verses in the Quran. Some people have counted 750 or more, about 1/8 of all the verses of the Quran that deal with natural phenomena, understanding, exploring, contemplating, and so on. And so it encourages the Muslim to go and observe, to go and understand, and so on. And so that was an impetus, that was a drive for Muslims to develop that kind of understanding and knowledge. You can't just look at something and say, oh, it looks nice, but I have no idea how it works. I don't know why these planets are here tonight, but they are not here next month or something. It is important to understand. So those two things together, understanding, exploring, and knowing God through his creation by understanding these phenomena, not just looking at them, plus the practical benefits of science, were the two sort of driving forces that led to the flourishing of science in the Islamic era. Just to give some examples about the glorification of knowledge in Islam, Al-Kindi, the so-called first philosopher of the Arabs, wrote, our goal must be to garner the truth from wherever it may come, for nothing is of higher importance to the seeker of truth than truth itself. Avicenna on the importance of requiring proof, not just knowledge, but how you prove, how you establish knowledge that this is actually correct. He says, he who gets used to believing without proof has slipped out of his natural humanness. Meaning, if you're a true human being and you are worthy of being a human being, then you should require proof for anything that you are asked to accept or to believe. And then we have Al-Biruni, who adopted induction as opposed to a deduction, and had a long exchange of conversation with Ibn Sina, Avicenna, and so on. So all these people understood the value of knowledge and the value of methodology in knowledge. There were important institutions. So this is very important that we understand how science flourished. We understand not just why, what were the driving forces, but what were the institutions that allowed for science to really flourish and develop. And then we learn these lessons for today. So Famously, there were these houses of wisdom, particularly the House of Wisdom of Baghdad, but there were others in Cordoba, in Cairo, in Damascus, in other places. What were these houses of wisdom? They were centers of knowledge, essentially. They were what we today would call a center of research, a center where there's a lot of translation being done, there's a number of scholars, and there is a critical mass. They're always interacting and learning from each other and teaching to their disciples and so on. There were universities which, interestingly enough, were very often parts or extensions of the great mosques. The great mosque of Damascus, the great mosque of Arawiyin in Fez, there's the great mosque of Cordoba, and so on. So there were these universities. They weren't called universities at the time, but they were these big schools, Nizamiya in Baghdad, Mustansiriya, Al-Azhar in Cairo, and so on. So all of these, or most often, they would be close to or actually part and integral part of the great mosques, and they would have these scholars who are there assembling students around them, teaching them, etc. There's a whole discussion as to what kind of universities were these. They weren't universities in the modern sense, and that we can discuss later if need be. There were madrasas. Madrasas were typically schools of religious law. So these were the schools where imams, faqihs, and so on would be trained and graduating from. And these needed at least some working knowledge of mathematics, of astronomy, of a little bit of anatomy, of a little bit of maybe psychology, because they would be called in their practice of being imam in a mosque or being a faqih, issuing a fatwa, and so on. They needed to understand these basics. Otherwise, they would be asked questions about topics that they had no knowledge of, such as what direction do I pray if it is at night and I cannot see the sun, so I don't know where is north and south or east and west, and things like that. So they would have to know a little bit of astronomy, for example. Somebody comes and says, how do I divide my inheritance, or our father just died or something, then somebody has to be able to do some simple calculations. And then last but not least, the Islamic civilization was known to have developed great observatories. This is probably our biggest contribution to humanity in the field of science and in the field of knowledge. From very early on, from the year 828, 829, observatories were built in Baghdad, in Damascus, and then they became larger and larger until we got to a big observatory in Samarkand that had one instrument built into the ground that was a big arc, which radius was about 40 meters, 40 meters. So that gives you an idea of how big these institutions, and that went on all the way to the 19th century with observatories in Delhi, the Jantar Mantar, and in Jaipur, and in various places, in Maraha, what is now West Iran. All kinds of places developed very, very big observatories that contributed important knowledge in astronomy at that time. What about Muslim women? I hinted at the beginning that some of the topics that we need to discuss are like, okay, so what about women? What about the status of imams and the status of religion? And how did we combine all of this knowledge? Was there friction between the religious dimension and the scientific dimension, and men and women, and all of that? So I want to give you just a couple of examples. So first of all, our knowledge of Muslim scholars, Muslim female scholars, Muslim women scholars, and particularly Muslim women scientists is very, very cursory. We know very, very little. We have only very few specific names. For none of them, we have written texts. We have books with their names on them. We have very little information about what they did. Some of them we know for sure that they existed because we have found tables and some manuscripts that presented information, scientific information, and so on. And one of them is this Fatima of Madrid. The reason why I picked Fatima of Madrid is because she became famous about 14 years ago. In 2009, the International Astronomical Union decided to celebrate the 400th anniversary of the invention of the telescope. So the whole year was actually declared by the United Nations or UNESCO as the Year of Astronomy, 2009. And so as part of the celebrations, they issued a calendar, a 12-month calendar. For each month, they went back in history and selected one figure and gave a month figure on that month. And one of them they picked was Fatima of Madrid, Fatima al-Majritiya, as she is known. Her father was one of the most famous early Muslim astronomers of Al-Andalus, of Muslim Spain, Maslama al-Majriti, and she was his daughter. And here we can just read quickly what the calendar itself says about Fatima of Madrid. She wrote several works which are known as corrections from Fatima with her father, Maslam al-Majriti, edited and corrected the astronomical tables of Al-Khwarizmi. They also worked on calendars, calculations of true positions of the sun, the moon, etc., etc. So clearly she did quite a bit of work, and some of her work, even especially after her father passed away, had her name attached on it because she did observations and then she made some corrections to the tables that they had received from Al-Khwarizmi. Al-Khwarizmi had lived about 150 years before them. So this is just one example. Two other examples that are known by name, although, as I said, we have very little manuscript and textual information about them, is Lubna of Cordoba, or Medinat al-Zahra. Medinat al-Zahra is sort of the palace city in the suburb of Cordoba. In the 10th century, was known to be an expert mathematician and overall intellectual. If you Google her up and look for Lubna of Cordoba, they will say intellectual. I'll say, okay, wonderful. So she was an intellectual in the 10th century of Al-Andalus. The other one, at the other, sort of almost other end or other side of the Muslim land, was Maryam al-Ijliya, or very often known as Maryam al-Usturlabiya, Maryam the astrolabe maker. She was known, so there are some paintings that you can find, or some drawings that you can find online. We have no idea if they really look like this or not. I suspect that these are just sort of artistic renditions and people representing them as one way or the other. So the one on the right is supposed to be Lubna, and the one on the left is supposed to be Maryam. Anyway, Maryam was known to be a very, very accomplished astrolabe maker. So that's how she became known in Aleppo, in Syria, the other side of the Muslim world, as I said. But these are very few names and very little information we have about them, what they did exactly, what they wrote, and so on and so forth. Then there was a decline. Then the decline of Islamic science. Why? There are a complex set of causes. Let me sort of leave that aside and we can come back to it, because it would take too long to try to discuss what happened from, who knows, now that even the date, then we say decline from when did the decline begin? That's a whole scholarly discussion as to did the decline start in the 12th century, 13th century with the fall of Baghdad, the Mughal invasion, the fall of Andalus in late 15th century, or what happened in the Ottoman Empire, which continued until early 20th century, and so on. So there was a decline for sure, because later we saw the production of scholarship and science almost dried out completely, but it wasn't even in different fields. In astronomy, it continued until at least the 18th, 19th century, but there were some patches. Anyway, I want to fast forward to today to try to keep my presentation as short as possible. What is the status of scientific thought in the Muslim world? To go back to the title of our conversation today. The short answer is we don't know well. Why is it that we don't know well? Because there are very few studies that today, sociological and scholarly works on what is the status of scientific thought in the Muslim world. Let me unpack this a little bit. When we say scientific thought, what do we mean exactly? There are three dimensions, at least, to what we may call scientific thought. There is scientific research, which is what people like me and Dr. Salman and Asim and many others do partly in our academic work. We do some scientific research, which is production of knowledge, new knowledge. And that can be measured by the number of publications, patents, the number of researchers, how much budget is allowed, how much does the government spend on research in different countries. And that can be a measure as to, is scientific research flourishing in these different countries? Is it more in the West? Is it more in the East? What about the Muslim world, different countries? So that's one dimension. Another dimension is what we call scientific literacy. What is scientific literacy? It is how the general public, the general population, if you pick your person lambda in the street, how much does he or she know in terms of basic essential scientific knowledge? So if you ask them some specific questions and you say, what is this? Do you understand this? How much will they know? This is what we call scientific literacy. There is a lot of studies of scientific literacy in many parts of the world, very, very little in the Islamic world. 3, there is now something called culture of science, not just scientific literacy, not that I know some essential scientific facts and theories, but how do I appreciate science? What is my attitude towards science? Do I defend science? Do I support science? Me, not just me, Nidhal Guessoum, but the typical Muslim adult who lives somewhere in the Muslim world. So if you pick them and you ask them questions like, how much money should we spend on scientific research compared to, I don't know, building better roads, for example, or improving our airports, or improving, I don't know, our hospitals or something. So how much they will say, oh, you can spend 2%, you can spend 1%, you should be spending 10%, 5%. So that gives you an idea about how much they value science, how much they appreciate it, how much they see it is an integral part of development, of civilization, and so on. That is known as culture of science. The science has infused into the society and is now taken up by the general public. As I said, there are scientific literacy tests done in the US and the world. You can see here, this is the most recent, as far as I know, 2018 or something. You can see all the countries that are shown there. And in fact, some of them are just European Union, and European Union in itself is more than 20 countries. You can see Canada, Israel, South Korea, United States, Switzerland, and so on. And then Muslim or Muslim majority countries, very, very few, if ever, do they participate or are there. So what do we know generally, just sort of to summarize very quickly? What do we know from anecdotal works, from small projects here and there, from different occasions that have happened, that we have noticed some issue? Recent episodes in several countries have rung serious alarm. So we have started to realize that, oh, wait a minute, there's a big problem here. Something has happened. So for example, when you get a PhD student submitting a thesis after 5 years of work, trying to defend a flat earthism, that is a serious problem. So the fact that flat earthism is spreading in the world in general, including in the Arab Muslim world, is a problem in itself. But when you have a PhD student defending this, that's seriously problematic. The Muslim world readily accepts and consumes high technology, from cell phones, high definition TV, high-tech instruments, and so on. So if you talk to people, if you talk to Muslims anywhere, they love high-tech. But if you talk to them about what we call basic science, so should we be spending money to study, I don't know, for example, the depths of the oceans, or sending rockets to space to explore, I don't know, the moon or Mars or something, then they start, like, wow, you're wasting money. Why is this and that? But if you say, but you are happy to buy a smartphone that costs $1,000, yes, very often, yeah, they're very happy. Give me, the latest iPhone or something. But you don't want to contribute per capita even $10 for an exploratory mission that will take us to the moon or something. They say, no, that's a waste of money. So there's a problem, sort of a dichotomy between supporting technology but not supporting science. And we know that technology cannot come without science, and science is the actual development, it's not the technology. But anyway, so that's sort of in general. I just want to mention sort of very briefly, and then maybe I will just stop here. I still have quite a number of slides, but I don't want to take forever. So about 3-4 years ago, we assembled what we call the task force. As you can see, it's called Culture of Science in the Muslim World. I was one of the conveners of this task force with a dozen experts from the Muslim world. It was under the patronage of Her Royal Highness Princess Sumaya of Jordan. And we met a couple of times, then COVID hit, and then we weren't able to meet, and then we tried to release our big report. We ran a survey. The survey, unfortunately, couldn't be done in person because of COVID, so it had to be done online. But because it had to be done online, then there were some shortcomings to the survey. How do you know who is answering, and how are they answering? Are they Googling the answers that they are giving you? Are they answering in their local language, Arabic, Urdu, etc., or are they trying to answer in English? Have they been educated in English or in their local language? Are they trying to translate? So there's all kinds of issues when you try to do surveying, especially surveying of such topics. We had, I think, in total 38 or so questions that we asked people. Some of them had literacy dimension, some of them had culture dimension, and some of them had attitudinal or psychological view on it. We have not released the results because it's, as I said, it's complex to analyze as to, okay, so how do we make sure that what we conclude is correct and is proper and can be defended? How does it compare with what exists elsewhere in the world? But these are at least some first steps to try to understand this scientific thought or scientific literacy, scientific culture in the Muslim world. But there is a lot more to say than this. So I'll just stop here. As I said, I have quite a bit more to say, and I'm happy to address questions on any issue, including and especially those that I haven't been able to cover because of lack of time.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Guessoum. It was a very nice overview and insight from history to current problems that we are facing as a Muslim society in general when it comes to scientific thought processes. I would like to basically start from you started your talk, and that is you raised a very important point of utilitarian aspect to why science flourished at that time. So if I understand, let's say if we look at the utilitarian perspective, and if we think that this could be the driving force, usually the utilitarian perspective is connected to masses, not the elite, which means these are not the rulers who feel the need of something, and then they inject money into or provide resources to establish something like Baitul Hikmah or House of Wisdom. So surely, please correct me if I'm wrong, this could be coming from the the need of the masses. And if that is the case, what was at that time? So for example, at that time perhaps we did not have the free economy that a businessman, a private entity, considers this as a good business model, a good business case by establishing an institute. So it must have been established by the rulers. But rulers usually feel threatened by the masses if they start critically thinking. So this means if you look at that time, this looks like that the rulers at that time were very open, that they were allowing the masses, not keeping them suppressed. Rather, they were allowing, by establishing such institutes, allowing them to develop critical thinking, which could be a threat to them. So was it like this? And why then, if that was the approach of ruler, for example, Harun al-Rashid, let's say, for Baitul Hikmah, why then it disappeared? What happened, later on that this kind of approach from the rulers started to vanish?
Yes, thank you very much. That's a very important question, and it has several dimensions to it. Some of it positive and some of it negative as to the development of the science. I don't think we can say it came from the masses or the utilitarian aspect was driven by the masses. So for example, Khwarizmi had no need for the masses when he developed his algebra and wrote in his introduction, look, this is going to be useful for all kinds of applications in Muslim life. So for him, it wasn't like, oh, the masses are going to love this and I'm going to sell a lot of books, so let me develop this algebra. As I mentioned, Al-Ma'mun, shortly after, he is the second caliph after Al-Mansur in Baghdad. Shortly after the construction of Baghdad, decided that I need to build an observatory outside of Baghdad, and I need to build an observatory on the mountains just next to Damascus. That had nothing to do with the masses, and that had to do with glorification of knowledge in general and glorification of their names. I mean, these people were a little bit narcissistic, if you like. I mean, they had some big egos, these rulers. They wanted to be known as, the great rulers who, developed this and built this big thing and so on. So some of them built big castles, some of them built big cities, and some of them built big observatories and so on. And they started to hear, because at that time, because of the interaction with the other cultures and peoples, especially the Indian one first. People tend to think it was the Greek knowledge, or it was the Indian knowledge first, and then the Greek knowledge. But this interaction started to tell the Muslims that we are behind. There's a lot of stuff that these people know that we don't know. And so there was a drive to translate and learn everything that they know, and then to take it forward. So Al-Ma'mun was saying, I want observatories, and I want works, and I want Bayt al-Hikmah was built by Al-Ma'mun himself, including the observatories, because I want the pursuit of this knowledge and to go even beyond what these people have reached. So in a way, it was, so if it coincided with the needs of the masses, then even better. So for example, if you're a ruler and people come to you all the time and they say, you cannot even tell us when Ramadan is, and look, you decided that Ramadan is tomorrow, but there's some people who said they saw the crescent last night. So there's a big problem here. What's the value of all these scholars that you have and these observatories if you can't even tell us? So that's masses, and the masses will ask and will want. So if you provide for them something that makes them happy, then everybody wins. But it's not the main drive. It's not, oh, the masses are going to love this, so let's do this. In fact, a lot of the knowledge that was being developed had absolutely no application whatsoever. I mean, a lot of the cosmology and the cosmography and the planetary orbits, and who cares, right? Okay, you can develop prayer times, better tables, you can determine better calendars, but there's a lot of science that was being developed. I mean, you don't need, by the way, you don't need big observatories if all you want is prayer times, direction to Mecca, and Islamic calendar. But the observatories were being developed because they would provide knowledge that would compete with and exceed what the Indians and the Greeks had produced so far. Now, the problem with the rulers is that knowledge became too tied to the rulers. And so we lacked institutional continuity. So instead of having independent universities, for example, independent centers of knowledge that would be endowed, there was the whole tradition of waqf and endowment, but very, very rarely would it fund observatories, for example, or fund Bayt al-Hikmah. It would fund a mosque, it would fund students coming to learn something, yes, or fund even a hospital. So we had endowments, waqf, that would help in specific cases that would be beneficial to everybody, but the development and research, or scientific research, was very often tied to the rulers. I'll give you just one last example. The Istanbul Observatory was built in 1577. So this is late 16th century Istanbul Observatory, which had the whole sort of research center tied to it. In some references, it says 15 to 20 astronomers working full-time at some point over there, paid by the ruler. And then guess what? 2.5 years later, it was destroyed. Why? Because the next ruler comes in, and people around him convince him that these guys are doing something that is un-Islamic. They're trying to, sort of peer into the knowledge of the heavens, and they're doing something that is not properly Islamic. And his understanding was, okay, this is not Islamic. Why do we need this? So he said, destroy this. This was built by my predecessor. He was maybe too enlightened, and I don't want any of this nonsense. So knowledge was very much tied to the rulers, and sometimes it would flourish, and sometimes it would be completely, literally destroyed.
Okay, connecting to that point and coming to today's situation. So, for example, if you look at some of these issues that you highlighted, for example, prayer time, start of Ramadan, whether they should be cited by the naked eye or through instrument, these are still debates in, for example, especially the part where we live. There is often confusion, who to follow, things like that. So these questions are still there, but what has been, if this is not a strong word, what has been ailing now in terms of, let's say, the approach that rulers see, that they are no more, even if the needs are there from the masses, let's say, And even if they can adopt the same approach, that spreading the wisdom coming from, let's say, scientific development, or Islamic, for example, promoting on the basis of that, so they can still make these claims, this sort of like narcissistic approach. But even then they are not doing it. So this means the focus from the people who have the possibility to make the resources available, now it has shifted, although the needs are almost the same. So what is the problem now in the Muslim world? Why we are not building the science and technology infrastructure to flourish the like scientific thought process?
Yeah. So there too, there's a problem of how independent is science from the rulers and how independent is science from the class of ulama. So if the rulers, there were certain cases in the 20th century, or late 20th century, second half of the 20th century, early 21st century, when the rulers decided that we're going to go sort of the more rational route. And they would impose that, okay, from now on, Ramadan will be started on the basis of this, and stop this, naked eye sighting and all of that. And this went on in a number of countries, in Turkey, in Tunisia, in a number of countries where it was, there was no waiting, no need for naked eye sighting, etc., because the rulers decided that this is the more rational, the more organized, modern way to go. So it's the rulers who decide. The solutions are provided by the Muslim scientists, such as myself. We say, okay, you want the calendar? We can construct the calendar. You want prayer times? You want this? We can do for you. But then in the end, it's the rulers who decide. We go this way, we go that way. In some cases, it was the other way around. The rulers wanted to go the populist way. So they did not want to shock the population. They didn't want to have to argue and debate with the class of ulamas. So the ulamas are saying, no, we go with the naked eye sighting. Then the rulers say, no, we go with naked eye sighting. There are Muslim astronomers who can do all of this for us. Well, thank you very much. But until further notice, we go this way because our population and our ulamas, this is what they want. So we go that way. So it really depends on how the rulers want to proceed with the society. They want to take it forward, or they want to make it comfortable and quiet, and whether we get into all kinds of complications. So, for example, the fact I have always argued, I've written even books on this. I have argued that if you follow naked eye sighting, even for Ramadan and Eid, then essentially you are saying we do not use calendars. Calendars have been used for thousands of years by humans all over the world, thousands of years. All countries, all peoples, all cultures, all societies developed a calendar. Why? Because you need to plan. You need to plan for agriculture. You need to plan for seasons. You need to plan for your travels. You need to plan for weddings. You need to plan for everything. Now, the example I tell people, I say, suppose I go to the West and I tell them, our month of August, our 8th month, which is Sha'ban, the equivalent to Sha'ban, the one before Ramadan. I say, our month of August, we don't know if it has 30 or 31. In our case, 29 or 30. But if it's August, then I say, we don't know if it has 30 and 31. We have to wait until the last day, the 30th. And then they will tell us if the next day is August 31 or September 1st. Everybody will look at me like, what kind of nonsense is that? What kind of society do you live in? Then how do you know if your meeting, which is scheduled for September 3rd, is going to be after 3 days or 2 days, and whether you have to travel to another city or not? How can you live like that? You can live without a calendar? I say, well, I'm sorry, this is how we do it. This is how we do it. So you cannot do proper planning. You cannot do proper civilization without a calendar. The Islamic calendar has existed for more than 1,000 years. More than 1,000 years. But what happens is they will tell you, for civilian purposes, meaning for your salary, for your vacation days, etc., we will use the calendar. But when it comes to religion, no, we use naked eye sighting. And then on some month, then we have to readjust the calendar because, now Ramadan has started, and in the calendar it said it shouldn't be starting now. And that's the problem. The problem is, who is the authority to tell people this needs to stop? And unfortunately, so this gets tied to democracy, to rule of law, to are the rulers allowed to, with the class of ulama, to decide that we will, for all practical purposes, live without a calendar? I mean, is this reasonable? Can we do this? On the other hand, can rulers just come and say, okay, ignore all your religious injunctions, this, sighting by the eye, etc. Ignore all of that. We're going to go the modern way, which is what happened with Turkey for some time when it was very secular. This is what happened in Tunisia when it was very secular, and so on and so forth. We need to find, this is where this scientific thought in Muslim societies, the title of this session, is absolutely crucial. We need to find a proper balance for how do we think with scientific knowledge of today, which comes and introduces some game changers in a number of topics that we Muslims have to contend with and have to engage with. And that's what I have been working on for the last 20 years or so, writing about harmonization of Islam and science and things like that.
Okay. Last question from my side, Professor Guessoum, before I ask Salman to continue. You mentioned important thing that we have to, let's say, take a step, radical step, and we have to see the big picture where we want to take our societies. But the problem, I don't know if it existed that way in the past, but currently what we see is that we want, sort of the scientific interpretation has been divided into theistic and non-theistic way. So this means for us as Muslim societies, we do not seem to be ready to accept anything that has non-theistic view, which means any non-theistic we consider atheistic interpretation of let's say scientific theories. So we want to frame everything within the theology of Islam, that is Quran and Sunnah. So we have a map already defined. If anything, and we are defining the scientific theories we want to define, and those scientific theory by nature could stand the test of falsification. So this means the framework that we are using or we want to use to define those theories, that framework we do not accept to be challenged, but something that we want to define by nature, is ready to be to the falsification. So then how do we reconcile? How do we convince, for example, when it comes to topics like evolution and other topics, then suddenly we see that this is in total contradiction to our framework or our worldview. So then if this problem is not solved, how do we move forward?
Big problem, very difficult. I'm not going to solve this in the next few minutes. I've written, again, hundreds of pages on this and haven't even come close to solving the problem. The first thing we need to understand is the nature of science. So whenever I give lectures, I explain to people what is the nature of science and what are the characteristics of science. And one of the main characteristics of science is that it at least tries to be objective. What does it mean that it is objective? It means it's independent of me and you. Whether you are theistic or not, whether I am theistic or not, whether I am an Arab or Pakistani, Muslim, non-Muslim, I live in Zimbabwe, wherever, the science, the knowledge that I produce through scientific research should be the same between me and you. So it's completely independent of my thought process, completely independent of my beliefs, my dogmas, my culture, everything. So once we reach facts, knowledge, established knowledge, as they used to say in the past, which is still a very important phrase, established knowledge, which we establish objectively. So it's completely independent. I tell my students in science, we don't have according to Einstein. It's not like according to Einstein, you can say in Einstein's model, okay, he has a model, and then we see whether it fits with the observations or not. And then in the end, it gets improved on by so many people, it even loses the name of the person. Darwin's theory today, I tell students, I say, if Darwin came today and attended one class on evolution in any university, he would probably not recognize even half of it. You say, what? First of all, wait a minute. What is this gene thing? What are you calling mutation? What is this DNA? And then what is this sexual selection? And then all kinds of things that are now integral parts, essential parts of the evolutionary theory, Darwin would not even understand. So it's not that Darwin, whether he was theistic, atheistic, what he came up with has absolutely no bearing on the theory itself. The theory will stand when we compare it to the observations and the experiments, and it will stand regardless of whether who wrote it is a believer, non-believer, Muslim, 19th century, 20th century, is absolutely irrelevant. Once we understand that proper science, and science that everybody has to accept, is absolutely objective, independent of everybody, this is why I have to accept it, because it has nothing to do with me or with anybody else. It has to do with nature itself. This is number one. Number two, we have had in the past a number of cases where people had to change their worldview once knowledge, once scientific facts became established. For example, how many people today reject the fact that the earth goes around the sun? There are still people who reject it knowingly, not out of ignorance, but reject it knowingly. But these are just, excuse my language, idiots. Okay, these are people who are just being stubborn, just really don't know what they're talking about. If you ask them for any argument or how they can defend this idea, they will just talk total nonsense. I can destroy anybody who talks to me about the earth going around the sun in like 30 seconds. And so the largest majority of humans, including the largest majority of Muslims, have accepted that the earth goes around the sun. Then what do they do with all the writings of the past scholars of Islam, some verses that seem to indicate, and the sun goes up, and while the sun is moving, they say, oh, we reinterpret this. We do hermeneutics, ta'wil. So we reinterpret these verses or these writings, because now we know for sure that the earth goes around the sun. The sun going up in the sky during the day is an apparent motion. So once you can call it an apparent motion, and you can interpret the past knowledge, including in the scriptures, as apparent. This is just explaining to you how it looks to us here on earth. Then there is no contradiction. The same thinking, the same reasoning that people applied to the earth going around the sun once it became absolutely established that the earth goes around the sun, we need to apply to the theory of evolution. We need to apply to all kinds of other things. What is a cell? What is a mutation? What is genetic engineering? What is CRISPR? And all kinds of things that Muslims have no choice but to contend with, but to contend on the grounds of the science itself, not my worldview tells me that I'm going to reject genes.
Thanks. Salman, please go ahead.
Yes, Professor Guessoum, when it comes to the science, for me, how I view the whole process is that sure, discovery and solutions are important, but what is more important is to first of all understand the problem, then appreciate the problem, that okay, this is really a challenging one, and then the solution or the discovery or things goes forward. But what we have seen over the years, and also while reading different books and articles, that whenever it comes to the scientific thought process or scientific discoveries in Muslim worlds, we always start with the things that we have actually provided, or the solutions that Muslims research scholars and scientists has provided. Do you think that that is also a problem that we don't really highlight from where the problem comes? Because I don't think that it is always the Muslims who have actually identified the problem as well. Maybe Greeks or Hindu in South Asia or some other part of the world, they have identified the problem, but since at that time we have the maximum amount of resources, we have managed to put more effort on that and got the solution. Because when it comes to the universality of the science, that it's a common knowledge, anyone can share, anyone can reproduce, it is very important to be part of the bigger community. Do you see that this whole thing just highlighting the good parts of us from the Muslim society is also a bit challenging, or that's one of the reasons that why we still try to connect every time to the Muslim era, not the overall how the science progress in the world?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a very good question. I think it depends on what we mean by problem. I think the concept of problem needs to be broadened. There are different types of problems. So sometimes there is a definite, practical, clear problem. When I go to wherever and I need to pray, it's going to be Asr time, let's say, then in what direction do I pray? So that's a specific problem. And then we ask the astronomers, can you tell me how to figure it out, where, in what direction to pray, and so on. And there's a problem, and there's research, and there's a solution that is provided. So that's what we tend to call problems or scientific problem. But sometimes it is just observing some phenomenon. It's not a problem. Like you look at the sun, and then after a while, if you get up, let's say early to pray or whatever, and then you look at sunrise, just say, let's say you look at sunrise or even sunset. So I like sunset. So every day I sit, just about sunset time. And after a while, I notice that, hey, wait a minute, the sun doesn't always set at the same place. Look, there's this tree over here, or there's this building, and the sun is sometimes here, sometimes it's over there. I mean, it doesn't jump like that, like I'm saying now, but it shifts. If you pay attention, it shifts quite a bit between winter, spring, summer, fall over the seasons, and it keeps going back and forth by a wide margin. So is that a problem? No, it's not a problem. But doesn't that call for reflection? And it's like, why does it do that? Most of the good questions in science start with, oh, that's odd. Somebody said, every time you look at something, you say, oh, that's odd. And that's the beginning. This is, as you said, you pose the problem. I just meant that the meaning of problem does not mean, it's a problem for me in my life. Like, yeah, just something, an observation that I looked at and I said, that's strange. I need to figure out, I need to come up with an explanation for this. Maybe the earth does this, or maybe the sun does this. And then if it does that, then it would mean that in the winter or in the morning, it would have to be here and there. And I try to figure it out. And then if that's true, then maybe if I observe it next month, then it will be doing this. And that's solving a problem. Once you figure it out and it fits, and you have come up with an explanation, or what we today call a model, then you say, oh, I figured it out, wonderful. And then you look at something else, or somebody brings a question to you, say, what about this situation? I never thought about that. So that's another problem. And sometimes it is not, a problem that you have even thought of. You just read it in the books, and you say, the Indians used to always worry about why the river does this in the spring, and it doesn't do the same in the winter, and this and that, and the water becomes, and I say, oh, but it has to do with the temperature maybe. And then if the temperature raises, then maybe the water flows more rapidly, or there is more fluidity or viscosity or whatever. You try to explain it just because you read it in the books, and then you try to say, oh, I can see the explanation they are giving, but that explanation doesn't really work, because if we are in a different environment, then because here we have higher altitude, then it's not the same. And today we know that higher altitude means density is lower and temperature drops and this and that. So I'm sort of going on a detailed or too detailed a discussion of what we mean by problem. I agree with you that all science and all research starts with posing a question. Let's put it this way. Okay, so there's a question. It could be practical problem. It could be just a conceptual question. It could be a historical issue that people have claimed. But then you say, I don't think that's true. I think I need to go back and redo the experiment on this, just to make sure that it is true, that it works as they are saying, or maybe there is a better explanation for it, and things like that. But you are right that we should have a proper methodology in doing scientific reasoning, and even more so scientific research, by starting, okay, so what are we trying to figure, and then how do we go about it? What is the proper method? How do we check that our results or conclusions are proper, and so on and so forth.
Thank you. And yeah, actually, this whole point of referencing is not just to highlight what others have done. It is also the way to appreciate that what they have done is correctly understood, and now we are progressing in terms of providing the solution. Thank you very much for your answer. My second question is more related to one of your articles. The title is "The Quran, Science, and the Contemporary Muslim Discourse." There you have very nicely covered the view that, okay, what is the role of Quran in Muslim world, and how different school of thoughts. Some try to use Quranic verses to explain the science, and some use science to explain what is available in Quran. But when I was reading that whole article, and also a couple of other things over the years, I always get confused that why we actually need to connect religion with science. What's the point of doing that? I mean, if I'm a Muslim, I'm a believer, then for me, Quran has its own standing, and I consider it a complete book. And then I have science that has solved many problems, many provided solutions to many challenging problems. But it's not complete, it's evolving. So how come I can connect a subset with a superset? If in my opinion, if Quran is a superset and it's a subset, because I mean there are definitely options where you can see that there is a complete alignment, but then you can find many other places where yet there is no alignment in that. So what's the point when it started to happen in our societies, that we started to bring everything from a observatory kind of knowledge towards Quran? And when we try to use Quran to tell like the science, whatever is telling us today, we already know that from this divine book.
So two things first. One is the Quran has always had a central place in the life of Muslims. And as somebody wrote, and I think I quoted, if you want to convince Muslims of anything in economics, in health, in whatever, you need to at least show that it does not contradict something in the Quran. And better yet, that it is in harmony with what the Quran says, even if the field is completely different. Because Muslims think, this is my reference, this is my constitution, so to speak, this is my law book, this is what I live with. I live through the Quran and not through what the economists say or even the doctors say. The more devout the Muslims, individually or as societies, are, the more reference they will make to the Quran. So you have to be prepared that even if I teach science all the time, and from time to time, people will not challenge, but bring up, say, but the Quran says. And then you can either say, now the other point I wanted to make is approaches to science and religion, not just science and scriptures, but science and religion in general. There are different ways. Some people say they should be completely independent. They should be in dialogue, maybe. They should be there's an integrated view, or no, they should integrate the whole thing. So there's different views. Stephen Jay Gould wrote a book referring to what he coined as NOMA, non-overlapping magisteria. Magisteria means two big spheres, non-overlapping. They are separate. So he says, okay, you have religion here, and you have science here. And these talk about ethics and values and how you live your life and what happens when you die. And these tell you how the world works, how nature functions, what are the laws of nature, and da, da, da. And these are completely separate from each other. You can have both, but you should not overlap them. And maybe that's one way to go. But in my experience in the Muslim world, people do not accept this complete separation. They will say, wait a minute, but the Quran tells us something about the heavens and tells us about our human bodies and tells us about, the embryos and tells us about all kinds of things. How can you tell me they are completely separate? So for example, you have some students who will be studying, let's say, anatomy or embryology, and then immediately it will pop in their minds that, oh, there are some verses in the Quran that talk about this. Now, go and tell them, no, these are completely separate things. Don't mix them and don't relate them and ignore it completely. You should only recite these verses when you go to the mosque and pray. And learn this when you are at university and in school. That will not fly. They will want to find, okay, so how do I fit the two or how harmonize them? Now, as you said, and in that article, I explained that in the 20th century, this started late 19th century because science exploded. Once science exploded and was producing new knowledge, by the ton, then people started to get panicky, started to get anxious as to how does this new knowledge fit with my Quran. Remember, in their minds, like it has to fit. They have to go together. I don't want this separation, which could have been a solution if people had argued, the reformers, if they had argued, no, the Quran is really for guidance and is really for values and is really for beliefs and so on. It's not about, how nature works and how your body works. If they had argued that and they have succeeded, then problem solved. But they didn't argue that. To this day, they keep arguing the Quran is for our lives and even for our governance. Okay, So people saw all of this knowledge and they said, okay, so how do I fit it with this? And then the two theories that you mentioned developed, which was, oh, this science will help us understand some of these verses, those that talk about the planets and talk about the mountains and talk about the rivers and the waters and this and that, and the bodies and the embryo and so on. And those who said, no, actually, since the Quran came first, then that knowledge must be in here already. Since the Quran is talking about embryology, and we are now discovering some embryology, why should we use this embryology to explain this? This came first. So they started to think that if we go and sort of dig a little bit smartly, we can find all kinds of knowledge. And then, of course, I go and criticize all of this and say, what kind of nonsense is this that you're going to calculate the speed of light by multiplying two verses, right? And things like this. So then it just takes on a complete tangent and becomes, but it is extremely popular. This idea that we're going to just dig and analyze some of these verses and be smart about them and fit this with this verse from here and this verse from here. If you put them together and you multiply these two things, then look what you get. And so people lose completely the idea of that. I personally don't think there is a problem in saying, how do we harmonize these two magisteria, to use Stephen Jay Gould's terminology? How do I harmonize them? Not separate them and ignore them, because that's not going to fly with the Muslim world. But how do we understand them? And I say, start first by understanding the nature of science. What is science exactly? How does it work? And what kind of knowledge does it give you? And then what is the nature of religion? What is the religion trying to do for you? Why is there religion to begin with in human life? Not just in Islam, in the human life. What is religion for? And then you can say, okay, so now how do I put them together?
But Professor Guessoum, continuing with the same notion, that because I see that in future there will be more issues. Previously, we were trying to explain astronomy using Quran, or Quran with astronomy. Then biology started to take its gears, and then we started to talk about embryology and all these things. And now we are in the era where we have artificial intelligence. If we don't stop these kind of discussions, then at some point maybe someone started to see artificial intelligence in with the same notion, which is, I don't see any point in that. And it will not gonna stop anywhere until, because I mean, science is evolving, one after another things are coming. So how long we can continue just spending our efforts in this kind of translations rather than actually contributing in terms of like how we can be part of the progression in the scientific world?
Oh, I totally agree with you. I absolutely agree with you. I mean, in all of my writing, I mean, I'm a little bit of a pariah in the Arab world because I criticize this whole approach of, science in the Quran stuff. But I try to solve it in a way that is not just, okay, guys, separate and then we're done, because that's not going to work. So that's not a solution. So I try to explain to people, okay, so what do we learn from the Quran? What are the general guidance principles? What is the Quran trying to teach us? And so there are some ethical principles, there are some altruistic principles, there are some values that we learn from it, there's purpose in life that we learn from it, and that can apply to science. So I cannot just do science without ethics. I cannot do science without values. I cannot do science without purpose. What is the point of this science exactly? And then, as you pointed out, I mean, this artificial intelligence is going to be almost an existential threat, right? So even how to deal with artificial intelligence, I need to bring some human values, some human principles, which I can bring from my religion, or some other people can bring from, some humanistic principles or whatever. I don't dispute. I'm not saying we're the only ones who have ethical or value principles. I'm saying every culture brings its values, and maybe we can find some common denominator regardless of what I believe and they believe. But we cannot just separate, because clearly now science needs some guidance and needs some fitting into where society is going. Otherwise, it won't work. But whether we should keep trying to find in the Quran artificial intelligence and God knows, I don't know, maybe exobiology or something, that is a complete dead end that we should have stopped decades ago. And it shouldn't take me, in 2023 saying, people, you have to stop finding pulsars in the Quran, finding black holes in the Quran, finding the genome in the Quran. I mean, it just drives you nuts. But we have to address it. So again, it's like earlier you were saying, when there is a problem, okay, there is a problem. We have to address it. We cannot just ignore it. So the solution is really to tell people how Quran and Islam are to be used for general driving of society, not into this nitty-gritty of this verse is related to this calculation of this thing in science.
Just last comment, Asim, and then we can. Sorry, we are already above our 1 hour session time, but Professor Guessoum, just one last thing, that when I was reading this article of yours, I really like the conclusion when you correct me if I misunderstood, that we can use science as a tool to better understand the book that we believe on, rather than going back and forth in terms of finding their things. So I really like.
So I tell people, look, when you read verses and it is talking about stars or talking about planets, there are many verses that mention the stars and the planets and the sun and the moon. What kind of picture comes into your mind as you're reading the many verses that mention the sun, for example? Immediately, if you have had any education, you imagine this big fiery ball of gas and plasma with all kinds of energy and radiation coming out of it, right? You're reading a verse in the Quran, but the moment it says sun, you've brought in information and knowledge that you got from science. So that science is illuminating your reading and maybe making it even more impressive, because you say, oh my God, the sun, I remember, it's 1.5 million kilometers across. It's incredible. It could take 1 million Earths in it. Immediately you have that information from science, which makes you even more impressed and more glorifying of God. So I say, is there anything wrong with this? Absolutely nothing wrong. I brought my true, correct knowledge of science, and it informed or illuminated my reading of some of the verses. I didn't claim that this information is in the verses. I got that from my astronomy teacher. I didn't get it from books of tafsir, obviously, but in reading. So this illuminating and making me understand and appreciate better this book of mine, I think is a good way to go.
Okay, Professor Guessoum, the time that we requested from you is already passed. We have questions. Perhaps if you allow us, we can take 2 questions from audience.
No problem. Take as many as you need. I'm yours.
Okay. So then the first question that came from Zaki is that it is not the West against Muslim world when it comes to science. Rather, it is like ulama versus the Muslim scientists that need to develop a common worldview. And the question to you is that how this can be done.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I would have phrased it a little bit differently, but yes. So this ulama, the problem with the ulama is the training and teaching of ulama. I can't generalize and say everywhere in the Muslim world, obviously, because it varies a lot from one country to another. But in the traditional countries, let's put it without naming them, people will know, the traditional training of the ulama today does not incorporate enough of the modern science and understanding what is science, how does it work, what is it telling us, and for anything that tells us, what is the evidence for it. Once we understand this much, that there is something called nature of science. What is science exactly? What does it aim to do? How does it do it? What are the main knowledge or the main conclusions that science has drawn in at least the main fields, and how did it do this? Always insist. I tell the students when I teach astronomy especially when I teach astronomy, I say, listen, you're going to hear a lot of fascinating stuff this whole semester. I promise that. And I think I can say from experience, you're going to love it. But the point is not that for you to be impressed or to love the stuff that I'm going to show you on the screen. The point is to always ask yourself, and if you cannot answer the question, you need to challenge me and say, how do you know that? Where does that come from? How did you guys establish this? Not, oh, that's one fantastic. Oh, the teacher said, the sun has a diameter of 1.5 million kilometers. How do you know? Oh, the sun produces this much energy per second. That's incredible. How do you know that figure? Anything I give you, any figure especially, you need to say, where did that come from? Did you measure it? Did you calculate it? Did you relate it to something else? I need to understand. That's how science works. This attitude, as basic as it is, and I teach astronomy for non-science majors, and I teach astrophysics for science majors. For everybody, I say, if you stop asking yourself, how do I know this? You are not doing science. And this principle, this approach needs to be inculcated to the ulamas. Once they start understanding this, then we will have made huge progress. And then they will be friends of ours and we'll be friends of theirs. And we say, okay, now let's talk. Let's try to help each other understand mutually. And you will not be just looking at us like, you guys have brought some Western stuff and you're trying to impose things on us. We are not bringing Western stuff. I try to explain and emphasize this is universal, objective. It has nothing to do with anybody in Japan or in Philippines or in Brazil will find the same thing. It's not coming from the West, guys. But the only reason you say the West is because you don't understand how science functions. So once we clarify all of this, then the ulamas will start to understand this science and befriend it and not be afraid of it and not object to it because they see it as something Western, something atheistic, something that is against God or ignores religion or tries to tell people that everything can be explained without God. Once they understand all of this, and this is absolutely crucial, then the Muslim world will have made peace between its religion and the science.
Thanks. A second question from someone named Irwad is that a common perception is that having a scientific mind or acceptance of science takes you away from religion and up to the point where you perhaps, I don't know if he wants to say rejection of religion. So most Muslim scientists lean towards atheism. How do you see this?
So that statement, most Muslim scientists lean toward atheism, is just not true. Just not true. First of all, there have been studies now in the last 10 years or more. There used to be studies and surveys in the West, again, because the West does all kinds of surveys like this in sociology. This is called sociology of science, trying to look at scientists of different levels and different disciplines and how religious they are and what kind of beliefs and what kind of denomination or what kind of religion they subscribe to, etc. And in the West, it is true that a majority generally is non-believing. Some of them are more agnostic, some of them are totally atheistic and materialistic. But in the West, yes, now in between the US is a little bit softer, but especially in Europe, etc., the majority of scientists are non-believers, let's put it this way, whether agnostic or atheistic. But then there were no surveys done in the rest of the world. And so now we have started to see some sociologists doing studies of, so these scientists, people like me and you, who are in different fields, in astrophysics, in computer science, in biology, in geology, in medicine, and what have you, what are their religious beliefs in different countries, in different cultures, all the way from Japan and China to Brazil and Argentina. And the general conclusion of that is, other than the West, the majority of scientists in the rest of the world are actually believers. They believe in some form of religion, but their beliefs may be a little bit slightly unorthodox, let's say. They don't necessarily believe in miracles. They don't necessarily believe in saints or whatever, God's intervention, and that, for example, earthquakes are an act of God or something like that. So you will have scientists who have some beliefs that are slightly deviating, to some extent deviating from the traditional beliefs, but in general, they are believers. So it is not true that most Muslim scientists lean toward atheism. And it is not true also that science necessarily takes you away from religion. It may modify your beliefs. It may force you to think some things, or not force you, but lead you to think, for example, that I don't believe in miracles, or I don't believe in certain practices, like bloodletting or whatever, even though it's not really from the religion, but widely practiced in the Muslim societies, and people refer to it as coming from the Sunnah. This is coming from the Hadith, so why not practice bloodletting, hijama, and all of that? And so many of the Muslim scientists, including myself, say hijama, no, sorry, that doesn't work. That's old medicine. That's what people used to do 1500 years ago, but we don't do that anymore. We have some proper medicine today, etc. So science will push you to accept and reject certain things, but not necessarily to accept or reject God and religion altogether.
Okay. Last question from my side, and then I would like to ask Salman if he, like, want to conclude the session. So, Professor Guessoum, one thing, like, for example, if you want to looking into future, if you want to have a solution, and if we are not looking, let's say, towards a specific region where Muslims reside, rather, let's say, if we now the way the Muslim population has migrated to Europe and beyond, looking from China to the US and covering the Middle East, all. So it looks like that perhaps we again, since promoting the scientific development requires also in our societies some sort of, I don't know if it is right to say, conformity with religion. So do we need a center that represents the whole Muslim Ummah, similar to, let's say, Baitul Hikmah or Jamiatul Azhar at one time? Are we missing something like this, which has, let's say, a center with certain authorities that people, Muslim people, look up to, and there the ulemas and scientists, top scientists from the world and top ulemas coming from all regions, they are on the same platform. They define how we want to move forward in future, as Muslim societies, and that center, or let's say, the platform can guide overall, not individually countries, but rather the whole Muslim societies. Is this something, I mean, like a right way to approach the things, or you think this is not possible or does not make sense?
Well, some ideas like this have been tried and are being pursued. Let's put it this way. I think with limited success, such as, so in the West, for example, in a number of countries, from the UK, the Royal Society, from all the way from Italy to Sweden and so on, there have been academies of science that appeared several centuries ago, and people realized that we need to get the scientists, or we need to get the thinkers. So sometimes they are academies, sometimes they are royal societies, which are either specific to science or interdisciplinary, can bring in people from different disciplines and different even philosophers and so on. And let's talk about some big topics and issue white papers or books of recommendations and things like this. And it has worked to some extent in the West. The Royal Society in Britain, the academies of science have had important directional impact on how science should progress. When, for example, there is a big issue of, let's say, climate change or genetic engineering or artificial intelligence nowadays and things like that, and the government wants to do something in a given country, where does it go? It goes to the Royal Society, it goes to the academy and says, you're the learned people who know this stuff. Can you please address the following? Here are the following questions that we want to learn, to hear from you. We are contemplating putting together a policy or new laws to govern, I don't know, genetic engineering or whatever. And so it works to some extent that way if society understands that this is the learned society and this is the government and here are academias, and they function together in a sort of multi group or institution, interinstitutional way. In the Muslim world, we do have some institutions of that kind, but because the Muslim world maybe is too diverse, and because of all kinds of, again, we go back to the rulers and the governments and their interventions and impact. So we have an Islamic Academy of the Sciences, inter-Islamic. And it has existed for, I don't know, 20, 30 years, for more, maybe 30, 40 years. It has existed. And they meet several times a year. And but Have you ever heard about them? Have you seen something significant? Have you seen any impact from that? And that's a problem. We have at least a number of Arab Muslim countries that have academies of science. Have you ever heard something from these academies of science directing society, saying, here's how we need to deal with COVID, here's how we need to deal with this issue or that issue, here's how we need to limit CO2 production or whatever? You never hear from them. Why? Maybe because the rulers consider them as something, extraneous. It's like, okay, you guys are over there, discuss and write papers as you like, but we are the government, we don't deal with you until we need you for some reason or something. So again, it is a matter of internal governance. It's like, where do these bodies of learned people, where do they fit in society? What is their role? How do we use them properly? How does the government know that on various issues, it needs to first go, just like it goes to the parliament, it needs to go to these academies and ask them for that input, because you can't make a law on COVID, or you can't make a law on, economic issues without talking to the economists or without talking to the biologists. So once we figure out how the Muslim societies function internally between the rulers and the ruled people and the learned academies and the universities and so on, at that point, I think the problem will start to get resolved, inshallah.
Okay, Salman.
So I think it's time to close the session. And once again, Professor Guessoum, thank you very much for this enlightening discussion. We really enjoyed that. And there are some compliments from the audience as well. So with that, I just would like to mention one more thing to our audience, that in our next session, we will be talking to Professor Salim Al-Husseini from Manchester University. The overall team will be the same, but the topic will be different, and soon we will announce the topic and the further details there. So thank you very much, Professor Guessoum, and it will be very nice if we can get a chance again to talk to you from the platform of further.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I enjoyed this conversation and this meeting. I think this is very valuable to open up these discussions so we understand each other. We won't come to definite conclusions, in 1 hour or one session or something, but the more we explore these issues and we listen to each other and we learn some more, including with the audience that is, presenting some comments and some questions, the more beneficial it will be to the Muslim societies in general, from Malaysia all the way to the rest of the world, actually, because there are Muslim communities all the way to South America. So I thank you for your initiative. I thank you for the invitation. I enjoyed the conversation, and I will be more than happy to participate again in the future.
Thank you very much.
Thank
so
you.
Nice of you.
Thanks so much.
Bye.